My Brother Sam is Dead, Chapter 9. When I woke up in the morning, it had stopped snowing and the sun was shining. Water was running in the small streams off the roof. It was pretty, everything a foot deep in snow and the sun sparkling off the fields. But even though it was pretty, I didn't like it. Plowing through the snow a foot deep with the ox cart all the way back to Redding was going to be miserable work. Our feet would get soaked right away and stay wet and cold all day long. And as the snow got warm and then chopped up by the oxen, we'd find ourselves stumbling around in a slippery mixture of snow and mud. Miss Platt gave us a breakfast of biscuits and gravy. We said good-bye to everybody, hitched up the oxen, and pulled out into the yard onto the road. "Are we going to have an escort?" I asked Father. "I don't know," he said. "Platt rode out last night to arrange for one, but with the snow, people may not want to ride. But that works two ways. The raiders might not want to ride either. You work the oxen, I'm going to ride ahead." So that's how it went. Father would ride out a mile or two and then ride back to see how I was doing, and then he'd ride out again. That way, if he ran into the cowboys, he could race back to me and we could find a place to hide. "If you hear me shout, don't wait. Run for the nearest piece of woods you see. They won't come into the woods on horseback in this snow." The only trouble with this plan was that there usually wasn't any woods close to the road. Most of the farmers had used up the trees near their houses and had their woodlots on the back land, but still there were some patches of woods here and there. So I plowed along through the snow and kept looking around for woodlots to run into if something happened. It wasn't going to be easy running into that snow, though. But there was nothing to do about it but push on. The oxen were more willing to pull than they had been the day before. It was warm enough, and there were no snow blowing in their faces, but they kept slipping, especially in the hills. I would have to tug and pull at them to keep them from going forward. I was alone most of the time because Father was out of sight, somewhere up the road. In the snow, Gray made very little noise, so that I couldn't hear him coming. Every once in a while, Father would surprise me by riding up silently into sight. He'd wave, and I'd wave back to let him know everything was all right, and he'd ride away again. I didn't like being alone so much. Suppose the cowboys came suddenly up behind me, or suppose they were hiding in one of those houses or the barns alongside the road. They'd get me before I could run. As I slogged along, I kept turning around and looking down the road behind me, trying to see around the corners and through the clumps of trees. About every 5 minutes I would imagine that I was hearing horses. I would jump around ready to run for it, and then I would look up and there would be nothing but an empty white sheet lying over the fields and hills. At lunchtime Father came back. We sat in the wagon, drank some beer, and ate some biscuits. "Ridgebury is about 2 miles up ahead," he said. "I'll ride through and come back, and then we'll go through together. I'll be a lot happier when we're through this place." He shook his head. "We might as well push on and get it over with, Tim," he says. "Bear up, it won't last forever." We got through Ridgebury all right. Some people came to the tavern door and stared at us as we went through. I guess they thought it was queer to see us trying to travel in the snow. Father looked grim. "If nobody knew we were around before, they do now," he said. Then we got out of the village and rode on ahead again, scouting. My feet were wet and cold, and I was hungry. Biscuits and beer don't make much of a lunch when you're working oxen along. To keep my mind off my troubles, I began trying to name all of the counties in the world, or all the countries in the world, which I was supposed to know because I'd learned them in geography. Some of them were easy, England, France, Sweden, Russia. But there were all the little hard ones too, like Hesse and Tuscany and Piedmont, and it took me a while to decide if I should count America or not. If the rebels won the war, then we would be a country, but Father was sure they were going to lose, so I decided not to count us. Another trouble was keeping them all straight in my head. After I got over 20, I'd sometimes forget whether I'd already counted Serbia or India or some other place. I had to go back and do the whole list over again, and I was trying to figure out whether or not I'd counted Arabia when it suddenly hit me that I hadn't seen Father for a long time. I was shocked. How long had it been since I'd last seen him ridden silently into sight? I couldn't tell. It had seemed like it had to be a half hour, an hour at least, and maybe an hour. I jumped up into the wagon and looked back across the white countryside, trying to get a feeling of how far I'd come since I last saw him. All I could see was white, a few clumps of trees, a couple of farmhouses, and the muddy black trail of the ox cart winding through it. Where had I been when I last saw Father? I couldn't remember. Maybe I was wrong. Maybe it had only seemed like a long time. Maybe being involved with listing all the countries gave me a funny idea of time. But I didn't believe it. We'd come a long way, as far back over the hills as I could see, and that was a couple of miles. Now I was really worried. Of course, there were a lot of simple explanations. Father could have met somebody he knew and started talking, or he could have gone off somewhere to look for an escort, or he could have stopped at a farmhouse to get something warm to eat. There were a lot of explanations, but I knew none of them were true. If he'd been planning to leave me alone for a while, he would have told me. He wouldn't have left me by myself for so long. He just wouldn't have done it. So then what? Perhaps something happened to Gray. He could easily have tripped in the snow and hurt himself. Maybe Father got hurt in the accident too. Maybe he twisted an ankle or even broke a leg. No matter what it was, the important thing was for me to catch up to him quickly. I belted the oxen across their rumps with my stick. They grunted and shivered their heads and picked up their pace a little, but 5 minutes later they had slowed again. I hit them again, this time harder. They went faster, but hardly for more than a minute or two. They couldn't go much faster because of the snow, and even if they could, they just weren't going to. They weren't horses, they were oxen, and they just plain didn't move fast. That worried me some more. If Gray had slipped, Father might have been hurt badly. He might be bleeding or even lying unconscious in the snow, and to tell you the truth, I was feeling scared and lonely without him. I wanted to find him, so I pulled the oxen as far off to the side of the road as I could. I kicked away some snow so I could find some so they could find some weeds to graze on, and I started plowing up the road as quickly as I could. It was easy enough to follow Gray's tracks. Nobody else had been along the road but Father. It was hard trying to jog in the snow, but I began to sweat. Every few minutes I stopped to rest and have a good look ahead. If there was a rock or a high stump by the roadside, I would climb up on it and look ahead, but all I saw were the horse tracks running on and on. I went along like this for around 15 minutes, covering a good mile or maybe more, when I saw a patch of hemlocks bordering the left-hand side of the road. There was a farmhouse on the hillside then. Perhaps Father had gone in there for food or something. I considered cutting off the road across the field to go directly to the farmhouse, but then I decided I'd better stick to following the horse tracks in case. I plowed on until I came to where the hemlocks began to border the road, casting the cool shadow on the snow. There it was, written out for me to see, plain as if I were reading it in a book. The road was all turmoil of mud and snow, marked with dozens of hoof prints. There were more hoof prints in the hemlock grove, and then, going up on the road away from me, the tracks of 3 or 4 horses. The cowboys had lain in ambush and in the hemlock groves, jumped Father, and taken him away someplace. I stood there, I stood there in the snow trying to think, but my mind just stopped working. All I could think was that Father was gone. I began silently to pray, "Oh, please, God, oh, please." And then suddenly I realized that the cowboys might still be around, hiding somewhere and watching me. My neck began to prickle, and I swung around and stared off into the fields, and then back to the hemlocks. There was nobody. All was silence. No sound of horses, no sound of people talking, no sound of anything but a faint wind breathing in the tops of the hemlocks. Why hadn't they come back for the wagon? Perhaps Father had got them to believe some story, or perhaps they were going to do something with him first, and then come after me in the wagon. What I wanted to do was start running and not stop until I got home. It wasn't more than 12 or 15 miles. I could make it in 3 hours if I pushed. I was scared that was the truth. It felt so lonely to be by myself, with Father gone and maybe dead, and nobody but myself to do whatever had to be done. I was too scared even to cry. I just felt frozen, unable to move or think of what I could do next. But finally I told myself I had to stop being scared. I had to stop just standing there in the middle of the road. To get myself shaken awake, I jumped down a few times and clapped my hands, and that unfroze me a little, and I began to think. The first thing I did was duck back into the hemlocks to hide in case somebody came along. Then I asked myself what Sam would do if this were him, because he'd been brave and smart and would do the right thing. And of course Sam wouldn't go running home. He'd do something daring. The most daring thing to do would be to track down Father, which wouldn't be too hard in the snow, and rescue him. That would be daring, all right. I didn't have a gun, I didn't have a sword or anything but a knife and a stick. Then it came to me that even though rescuing Father seemed like the daring thing to do, it wasn't the smartest thing. So I asked myself another question. What would Father do? And the answer came pretty quickly, that he would get the oxen and the wagon and the load of goods back home if he could, so we'd have something to run the store and the tavern on through the winter. When I thought about it for a minute more, I could see that it was the right answer. Maybe Father would get away. The cowboys might even let him go after a while. One way or another, he would be counting on me to get the wagon home. That was for certain. I jumped out of the hemlock grove and started jogging back towards the wagon. The oxen wouldn't have strayed. Oxen don't wander when they're attached to a heavy wagon. The only risk was that somebody had come along and stolen them, or made off with the goods. I went along as fast as I could, all the while looking around for signs of people, but there was nobody, and in a few minutes I got back to the wagon. Everything was all right. I picked up my stick, banged the oxen on their rumps, and then they heaved and grunted and started off. There wasn't much point any longer in listening for the cowboys. I was pretty certain they'd be along sooner or later, and after they'd done whatever they were going to do with Father. What I had to do was figure out some way of persuading them to leave me and the wagon alone. I could always run up into the fields and save myself, but the point was to try to get the wagon home so we could earn our livelihood through the winter. About half-hour later I came to the hemlock grove and the place along the road where they'd captured Father. Now I began to watch ahead for tracks leading off into the sides of the roads where the cowboys might try to ambush me, but I didn't see anything, and I went on, trying to think of a good story for the cowboys when they came. The sun was beginning to get down in the sky behind me. It would be getting dark soon. Already it was getting cold, and a bit of a chill wind was springing up. I was just as glad of the dark, though. There were houses to pass by, the little villages to go through, and in the dark it would be safer. I planned not to stop for the night. I just pushed through all the way home. Besides, I didn't know of any place to stop. Father had friends along the way, but they were strangers to me. I went off thinking about something to tell the cowboys, and after a while I began to get an idea. On I went, belting the oxen when they slowed down. The sun dropped behind the hills in the back of me, leaving a red smear in the sky, which slowly turned black. I shivered. I was hungry. There were some more biscuits and jerked beef in the sack in the wagon, and a bottle of wine Miss Borgadus had given Father for a present. The wine would warm me up a little bit, but I decided not to eat or drink anything. I knew I was going to be really tired and cold and miserable soon enough, and it'd be nice to have food and wine to look forward to. I was thinking about the wine when I saw the cowboys. They were sitting on horseback in the middle of the road about 20 yards ahead of me. 3 black figures stock still in the night. The sight of those unmoving figures shocked me. I almost ran, but I didn't. Instead, I slapped the oxen on their rumps as if I hadn't any worries about who was standing in the middle of the road. One of the horses stamped, and his bridle jingled in the night. I cleared my throat quietly so I wouldn't sound scared, and then I shouted, "Are you the escort? I'm ever glad to see you." One of them pulled the cover off the lantern he had been holding. A circle of hazy light spilled out into the night, showing bits of horses and faces and guns in the trampled snow. "Pull up the oxen," the man said, with the lantern. The man with the lantern shouted. I stopped the oxen up and walked forward a few paces. Then the man with the lantern leaned forward and let the light shine on me. "It's the boy," he said. "Yes, sir," I said. "Father said that the escort would be along soon, but when you didn't come I was worried that the cowboys would get to me first." "We're not one of them started to say. "Shut up, Carter," the man with the lantern said. "Come here, boy." I took a couple of steps forward. Now the lantern was shining in my eyes. It was hard for me not to look up and see their expressions. All I could see was the horse's legs in the snow. The man's voice just came out of the glare. When did your father say the escort would be, or when did he say we'd be here? He figured that you'd be here an hour ago. That's why I was so worried. He told me not to worry, but I couldn't help it. He said that when the shooting started to fall flat, he said that when the shooting started to fall flat, and I'd be all right. I paused. I thought there'd be more of you, though. Father said there'd be at least a half-dozen men in the escort. He said just fall flat when the shooting started. There was silence, and then one of the others said, I don't like this. It sounds like an ambush. The man with the lantern swung around a bit to face him. Are you going to get scared off by this boy's story? What, sir? I said. Never mind, boy. Do you have anything to eat, sir? Shut up, boy. I don't like this. Let's go. The man raised his lantern to look at the others. Now I could see their faces a little. Oh, they looked tough, unshaven and dirty, wearing swords and pistols and muskets tucked in behind their saddles. Are both of you going to be scared off by the boy's story? He snarled. I still don't like it. How do you know it's a story? Oh, stop being a couple of old women. It isn't worth the risk, Judson. Let's leave. Not worth the risk. There's 100 pounds worth of stuff in the wagon. Judson, stealing rum is a hanging matter. I don't want to. Just then a dog barked off in the distance. The oxen bawled. Damn, one of them said. It's them. It's just a dog barking, Judson shouted. I'm not taking the chance. He wheeled off his horse in the snow, and the other did likewise. Damn you men, Judson said. But they had begun to gallop off through the snow, snarling. He pulled the cover over the lantern, and then he wheeled his horse too, and disappeared down the road. I stood for a moment, listening to the sound of their hoofs dying out into the snowy road, and then I began to laugh, and then cry all at once. My hands shook so hard I dropped the stick, and my knees were weak. I could hardly walk. I felt terrific, because I had fooled them. It would be a great story to tell Sam, but everything else was awful. Father being gone, and me being alone in the snow and the dark for hours to go before I got home. I climbed into the wagon and ate the biscuits and beef and drank about half the bottle of wine. I guess I was sort of drunk because I just kept putting one foot in front of the other, and by midnight I was home.